Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Are you a mental health professional looking to deepen your clinical expertise in healing complex trauma? We're thrilled to announce our 2025 NARM Therapist Trainings designed to provide you with transformative training in the neuroaffective relational model. In 2025, we're offering 3 Level 2 NARM Therapist trainings, 2 live online cohorts, and 1 in-person training in Scottsdale, Arizona. Both the in-person Scottsdale training and the spring online cohort begin in January of 2025, and the summer online cohort begins in May of 2025. These NARM Therapist trainings consist of 4 weekend modules spread out over the year. Through this advanced clinical training, you'll learn how to confidently and compassionately heal the impact of adverse childhood experiences and CPTSD. You'll gain specialized training in a relationally focused, neurobiologically informed clinical approach that supports the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. And you'll be joining a dynamic community that offers multiple learning opportunities to deepen your professional and personal growth. Enrollment is open to licensed psychotherapists, counselors, social workers, and other licensed mental health professionals, as well as graduate trainees and interns working toward licensure. Visit ComplexTraumaTrainingCenter.com to register for the 2025 NARM Therapist Training that best fits your schedule. We hope you will join us to learn how NARM can transform your practice. And now for our interview. Mariah Rooney is a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in treating the complex challenges that arise as a result of traumatic stress, attachment trauma, intergenerational trauma, and dissociation in children and adults. A passion project of Mariah's is the co-founding of Trauma-Informed Weightlifting, a radically fun and innovative nonprofit program that is now a part of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment at the Justice Resource Institute. As a previous fellow at JRI, she received extensive training in trauma and supported various projects and research efforts. Mariah is also an adjunct professor at the Graduate School of Social Work at Winona State University and a trauma-informed care consultant. Additionally, Mariah is a movement practitioner and somatic coach with extensive training in trauma-sensitive and culturally informed yoga and meditation practices. Please enjoy this conversation with Mariah Rooney. All right, I am sitting here with Mariah Rooney. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Really excited to dive into this conversation today. I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about what is it that you would like our listeners to walk away from our conversation today with?
Oh, that's a great question. What comes to mind is that there are infinite possibilities in terms of healing from trauma and from adversity. And that I think really central to anything that we do in our healing journey is our body and our nervous system, because it turns out they're along for the ride no matter where we go. And the more intentionally and thoughtfully we can invite them into our process can be really powerful and transformative. And also the power of healing in community and in relationship to other people as we move our bodies.
So great. This is like right up my alley. So if you could share with us, how did you get into this field and working with complex trauma? Because maybe a lot of people haven't heard about this idea of kind of blending the two together. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. So I had a previous career that was completely unrelated to this, and I feel so grateful for that because I think what it gave me was a lot of clarity when I made a pivot. And a part of the pivot early on was studying meditation and yoga nidra and yoga asana, and really feeling how impactful not only that was for me, but hearing how impactful that was for others I was in community with. And someone along the way turned me on to this idea of trauma-informed yoga. And I started hearing more and more about how people were bringing meditation and yoga into a variety of different settings. And so I followed that path for a while and taught meditation and primarily yoga nidra within the VA system, with active duty military, with folks who were incarcerated, people in recovery from addiction. And at some point, it just became really clear that I wanted to deepen and broaden my work in that space. And so luckily for me, my entry point was through the body. And I feel really grateful for that. So that led me into my initial graduate program, which was very much also centered in the body and in somatic practices. And and then eventually into my social work graduate program. I think a really important experience for me spent some years working in domestic violence and sitting with people who were holding the impacts of violence and intergenerational trauma in their bodies, both as the ones who had been harmed by the violence and also the ones who had perpetrated the violence, and seeing how important it was to find ways to tend more holistically to people in that work. I'll fast forward then a couple of years later, I ended up at the Trauma Center in Boston. And the Trauma Center, I think, has always been a home for supporting people and being really innovative and expansive in how we think about treating trauma, complex trauma, and dissociation. And it was, really part of the birthplace of trauma sensitive yoga and a lot of dissociation based models and ways of thinking. And I was surrounded by people that were innovators in the field and doing really powerful research. And so got to steep in that during my time there. And that really was where I ended up essentially birthing this idea for trauma-informed weightlifting during my time there.
You mentioned already, you're talking about the various, complex trauma. You're separating that even from shock trauma or single event trauma. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how you hold those terms and what those mean to you?
Yeah. Oh, that's a big question. I'm certainly not in the business of wanting to participate in gatekeeping labels, but I do think that offering some firm and flexible boundaries around what things are, what they could be, is important also just to help validate and normalize and contextualize people's experiences.
Right.
And how caring for yourself and one another after maybe a standalone traumatic incident, like let's say a car accident or a natural disaster, something like that, that if it's kind of held more individually, that the way that we approach that might look different. And when I think about developmental trauma and complex trauma, intergenerational trauma and historical trauma and all of these things, there's this continuity to the harm that we hold in our bodies and our nervous systems and our narratives, right, and the stories. And I think about that harm happening in the context of our families and cultures of origin. And then, of course, like the families and cultures that we continue to kind of exist within. And that the word complex to me is important because it acknowledges the nuances and the complexity of how we experience these things, that it's not universal, right? Like there might be some real shared experiences across people, but ultimately, to me, it's a real invitation to hold simultaneously the needs and experiences of the individual that I may be sitting with, as well as the collective and the communal aspects of how trauma is perpetuated, as well as how we heal from trauma.
I know that you're a licensed clinical social worker. And then you said your way in was sort of through the body. Do you have a lot of history with, strength training and that sort of thing?
How the hell did I get here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Ironically enough, it was through yoga. I was teaching yoga in a community setting, and there were some folks in there that kept saying to me, like, you should come lift with us. And I was like, I've done a little here and there, but it's just like, it hasn't been like a huge presence in my life. And eventually I said yes. And it didn't take long for me to really find that that was a transformative physical and embodiment practice for me. And that there was also a lot that was really liberating about becoming strong for me in terms of, being a femme person, right? And being a queer person, that there was something about finding ways to take up space in my body by being strong that felt really affirming. And there was so much that I found that translated from my studies and practices of trauma-informed meditation and yoga into the gym. And then especially when I started competing, I found my most zen moments to be when I could really channel the things I had learned through my yoga practice, and then vice versa, when I could translate the things that I would experience in my body through weightlifting into other areas of my life. And I've been hooked ever since.
Okay, so this is really what I'm hoping to dig into a little bit more. Would you share with us a little bit of your personal experience? Because you're naming some broad, ways that you experienced it, but I'm curious for you specifically, like what was that really felt so impactful?
I'm going to highlight a few experiences that I had that come to mind that feel like really pivotal kind of seed planting moments for me. And one was, I remember hearing my dad growing up. My parents both grew up in not so wonderful environments. And my dad used to talk about how the weight room was one of the only places he could let his anger and rage out because it wasn't safe to express it anywhere else. And that something about weightlifting for him allowed him to move that energy for him. And it was never very poetic and meaningful. It was just something he would kind of say in passing sometimes when we talked about stuff. And that was a seed planting moment for me before I even started in my own weightlifting journey, even though I had been an athlete. And then there's another really pivotal moment when I remember I was at San Quentin Prison with the Prison Yoga Project, and I was walking across the yard. We were walking to another building where we were going to be doing some work, and there was an area where a bunch of the guys were out lifting weights. And I remember just thinking for a moment, like, how important that was to have that accessible to people who are a part of the carceral system and being able to move their bodies and care for their bodies and have an outlet for that energy. And it was another moment, another seed was planted. And then I kept finding myself as I started my own weightlifting journey, standing alongside people that would talk about just casually, talking about things that had happened in their life because you're in the gym and you're standing around and people talk about stuff. And there was a lot of trauma stories in the mix. And then I found myself joining a barbell club with a really incredible coach. I knew some about his history too. And I remember thinking to myself, he's such a good coach because of what happened to him. Like, he has transformed his traumatic childhood into this presence that he holds in this space and not replicating the things that happened to him, which would be very easy to do in the context of a fitness setting because there's a lot of toxicity and harm that happens in those environments and just culturally within the fitness and weightlifting worlds. And there were a lot of people around me that as I got to know them, I learned so much about how the gym became such an important place for them to be in community, to feel strong, right? And even if it wasn't explicit, there was this kind of unconscious knowing that became really clear, which is the importance of people experiencing strength when they have experienced feeling powerless or hopeless. And these other moments where it's like, I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you like feel sore the next day and you just feel more connected to your body in that moment. Like, even if it's not the most pleasant, you're like, oh, right. Like, I did this thing. I did this thing. I cared for myself. I moved. I worked in this way. Or you're like, I didn't even know that muscle existed, right? There was just all these little moments that started coming together that, along with my work as a psychotherapist and as a trauma specialist, started clicking together in a way that made a lot of sense to me. And then I got curious about, what do we do with this? Where do we go from here?
Wow, there's a lot there. I'm so curious about a few things. You mentioned that those environments where strength training is happening, weightlifting is happening, that there can be a lot of toxicity there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what you feel differently in terms of how the spaces that you're creating.
Yeah, it's really important to nod to some people who have been in this space doing this work for a very long time. And that feels important to me because the reality is that there have been people that I really view as activists in the fitness world who have been saying we have to change the culture of fitness to make it more inclusive and to make it safer and less toxic. One of the people that I'm thinking about is Justice Rowe, who's the founder of Fitness for All Bodies. And then also Ilya Parker of Decolonizing Fitness. I consider them both just to be really important forces in the field who have been very loud on the mic for a long time, saying there's a lot of opportunity for change here. And so much of that dialogue is very much about inclusivity, but it's also about understanding the intersections between capitalism, white supremacy, the patriarchy, and fitness, and how the messages that we receive about our bodies, about what they're supposed to look like, about what a fit body is, who's welcome, who's not, how much money do you need to spend to get there. And then it also shows up, I would say, in some influences from the military industrial complex in terms of that kind of top-down boot camp style, drill sergeant style approach to fitness. I'm not saying there's not a place for that. Sometimes that's really fun, right? Like, we can opt into that and say, sounds like a good time. So I'm definitely not saying there's not a place for those things. But what I am saying is that when that is kind of the standard for an industry, there's a lot of people who are going to say things like, I'm never going to walk through the door of a gym. I don't belong there. None of the marketing looks like me. I don't see trainers in the space that look like me. I don't see other bodies in the space that look like me. And so it's something that we do a lot of work around, is trying to bring more awareness to the ways that we can shift culture and increase awareness in these spaces to make them much more welcoming and responsive to the needs of people that, belong, that really do belong there.
I remember years ago, maybe 20 years ago, there was like TV shows. It's like that boot camp kind of style of like, you better work it, feel the burn. Like, unless you're on the edge here, like you're not really doing something. And I remember, I think I was at someone's house and they were playing that show and I was just like, is that how it is? Is that how it goes? And I wasn't one that, had a lot of people modeling going to the gym, that sort of thing. But I used my body more in an artistic space, that kind of thing. And so I felt very intimidated by this idea of going to a gym, this idea of a different way of interacting with strength training. You also said something else that felt really important to me, experiencing strength when you've felt such powerlessness.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, for me was an entry point. I had an injury and I kind of had to work it in a specific way to rehab the injury. And that felt so amazing to me to feel like, oh, I really couldn't really move this. And now I feel so strong. And then I started following a few people in this space that you're talking about. I appreciate you mentioning those names.
It reminds me, one of the concepts that we talk about in our trainings is embodied metaphor, and how there is so much metaphor in how we move and how we experience our bodies, right? So an example is getting your first pull-up in any way, like whether it's on your own or with a little assistance, but that first time that you get your chin over that bar, it's a pretty monumental moment.
Mm-hmm.
And the metaphor in that of literally pulling yourself up, being able to do that, or being able to pick up in a deadlift, pick up heavy dead weight off the floor, stand it up, and then choose to put it back down and walk away. We've gathered these stories over time from people about how certain movements suddenly became the thing they translated into some area of their life. Like, if I can do this thing, then I can do that thing. And then having that physical, visceral, felt sense experience in your body. I mean, anyone who is strength, often if they've done it for a while, you can ask them, like, what are your favorite muscles to feel? Like, what makes you feel the best? And I know for me, it's like when I feel like I've really worked out my back, something about that sensation for me makes me feel really good, and paying attention to that and letting that kind of in feels great to me. And that would be a different answer for anyone.
Yeah. I can feel my body shifting into that lower kind of curved posture when I feel threatened or when I've been in that kind of situation. And so what you're naming here of, it feels good to have your back muscles engaged, and you're blending these different skills that you have. Can you talk a little bit more about the platform that you've created? Can you say more about that?
Yeah. I think because I was aware of trauma sensitive yoga and people in that space doing really powerful work, at the time I was connected with the Prison Yoga Project, I knew that there was a need for more trauma informed movement modalities. I would have so many clients in therapy who would say things to me like, there's no way in hell I'm going to do yoga. Like, absolutely not. That's terrifying to me, right? And to me, there's a time and a place for everything. And also, it's important that people have options because we're drawn to different things for different reasons and at different times. And sometimes I think the slowness and the mindfulness that is asked of a person in a certain practice can feel terrifying, particularly to people who have experienced a lot of trauma and who may be, really lacking in interoceptive awareness, or who may have hyper interoceptive awareness. And so other ways to move for them may feel really good. And why not make those practices more intentionally trauma informed? Why not also research them and understand how they help people, how they can help people, and what we can do to make those practices more welcoming and considerate of the experiences that people have had. And at the time, weightlifting was kind of my primary thing. And again, I had had all these experiences with others that had felt really inspiring. Just the other day, I opened a notebook and I found the original piece of paper where I was jotting out ideas for, like, what in the world could this thing be? Why do it? What might the aspects of a program like this be? It was fun to see. There was coffee stains all over it. So apparently it's well loved. But a part of it was also because I had had some pretty awful experiences in gym spaces and feeling unsafe, feeling objectified, feeling the toxicity of certain cultural aspects of the fitness world. And I just kept thinking, like, I wish there was a space that was accessible to me where I could walk through the door and this wasn't something I had to brace myself for, that the only thing I had to brace myself for was like the squat and not everything happening in the room around me. So it was about finding a way to contribute to change in these spaces, and then also thinking about how to open up a movement modality to people who could be really interested in it or intrigued by it, or who might already be in those spaces, and there might be a way to adapt how they're doing some of those things to help them very intentionally support their healing. And again, at that time, I was at the Trauma Center in Boston and had met with Dave Emerson. He's one of the founders of Trauma Sensitive Yoga. And he's like, wait, what is this thing? Like, what are you working on? And it just so happened that he and Jen Turner, the co-directors of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment, had been looking for other programs to bring into the mix within their center. And so we kind of, I would say, like dated each other for a while, and we would meet and I would tell them what I was working on and interested in and see if over time it might feel like a good fit. And at some point we decided to make it official, and then we became a part of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment, and we've been able to really grow from there, which has been wonderful.
Super cool. I was checking out your website and I noticed the essential principles of trauma-informed weightlifting. Can you talk about the essential principles?
Yeah. So we have 2 studies that we published this year, and a little backstory in terms of how we decided to approach research, because there is research on the impact of exercise on PTSD symptomatology, right? And I wouldn't say it's a massive field of research. I think we need a lot more. But there's very limited research in what happens when you explicitly take a trauma-informed approach to movement to support people. And also, I think it's easy sometimes to come in and say, like, we have this figured out. Like, we know what to do to make this trauma informed and what the most helpful thing is going to be for people because, this, and this. And our intentionality in starting with qualitative research was because we wanted to start the foundation of our research in the lived experiences of people. And so we intentionally interviewed weightlifters who identified as having histories of trauma about their experiences. And it allowed us to share the evidence of what is already out in the world and known, and like the wisdom of people, and also what's been helpful for them and harmful to them and things that they think about. And we feel really lucky that what was shared really aligned with what we had already outlined in terms of our principles. They felt very reinforced. It allowed us to expand on them, and we'll continue to do that over time. So we have that study, and then another study, Trauma-Informed Weightlifting Considerations for Coaches, Trainers, and Gym Environments. And that one was recently published in Frontiers in Psychiatry. And it allowed us to share these stories, and to tell people, like, these are really important things to think about in this work. So the specific principles that you're mentioning are also kind of rooted in one of our core tenets, which is do less harm and then do good. And that piece is really important to us because of all the reasons I've already stated in terms of some of the harm that is caused in these spaces and also the harm of trauma, right? And acknowledging systemic and institutional trauma and intergenerational trauma and all these things, that if we just show up with a desire to do good, that we actually can set ourselves up to do more harm. Because we're not paying attention then to the upstream issues. Like, are you just participating in the downstream stuff and helping people, pull people out of the river and giving them some care? Are you looking upstream and saying, how did these people end up in the river in the first place? And that to us is really important. So we merge our trauma-informed approach with anti-oppressive practices. We talk about that very explicitly, as well as anti-racist frameworks. And so the do less harm piece includes things like just having a foundational knowledge of trauma. Let's start there. What is trauma? How does it manifest? What causes it? How prevalent is it? Why is it important to pay attention and care? We talk about inclusivity, right? Because the opposite of that, exclusivity, means that we are causing harm, right? And then one of the things that I appreciate about some of the spaces I have been in and continue to be in as a psychotherapist is the encouragement of developing the self of therapist and having a lot of self-awareness in the work. But it's not encouraged all that much in the fitness world. So trainers and coaches don't have the same kind of framework. In some spaces there are, but generally speaking, it's not central. And so we say that has to be central. It's paramount. You need to have awareness of your biases and your prejudices and all of the isms that you embody in order to show up in this work. And then we move to the do good part. And that's much more about like being really responsive and in relational ways. So teaching people how to be, attuned. We talk about curiosity, like ad nauseum. We talk about how taking a stance of curiosity is super central because it allows you to approach things as a question instead of kind of a definitive answer all the time. Also helps to deconstruct some of the hierarchical nature of some of these relationships and settings. Supporting the awareness of interoceptive awareness, which there's really great research around in terms of the value of embodied practices for folks who've experienced trauma. seemingly obvious things like agency, autonomy, and choice when you haven't had that in the past, when things have happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
And then the community part, that relationships and community are a central part of healing. And that's also a big theme that we heard reinforced a ton in our research, which is that piece was so important to people, feeling like they belonged somewhere, having people know their name, say hello. That's a powerful piece for a lot of people.
That's a really beautiful piece, I think, of this work that you're talking about, is people knowing your name, showing up, feeling seen. This container of like, here, we're in this together. We're going to connect with our bodies. We're going to connect with each other. That feels not just safe, but like exciting. Oh, this is something I want to be a part of. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I've been working out at a rec center near me for a while, which is different because normally I'm in the rock climbing gym or I'm in a barbell club kind of setting. And so it's been different for me because I don't like, people kind of go and put their headphones on and do their own thing. And I notice how different it is to have that experience versus going into spaces where people recognize you, you recognize them, you say hello, you ask them how their day was, they cheer you on, they encourage you, they high five you when something doesn't go well, and they're like, it's all right, another day, another time. That's a part of how we heal in general. It's just taking what we know to be true in other spaces and then plopping it in the gym, or in, even if it's not in a gym, like, is it in the context of you working with a trainer or a coach or something like that?
Yeah. What if someone's coming to this and their trauma actually involves exercise? What if they're coming to this work and they're like, well, actually, part of my trauma was that I went to this gym and XYZ happened. And that's actually part of my trauma. And so the idea of overcoming that just feels really overwhelming. What would you say?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I think there's a few paths I would get curious about. One is there a more intentionally inclusive and welcoming gym in your area? Right? I think about spaces that are really loud about their stance about being inclusive, or gyms that are women only or are for femme and non-binary and gender diverse people, or people who want to be in spaces with people who share racial identities with them. There's a million different examples I could give here. Like, there are gyms that are specific to people who are sober, right? And being in community with other people who are sober. That, is there a space that maybe you're not aware of that you could find? And if not, there's opportunities, I think, to find coaches and trainers. We have a directory on our website of people who have done our certification program, and that will continue to grow. And I also recognize that some of these things are also inaccessible to people because they're expensive. And that's another major issue that we have, is people saying, like, this was my only option because it was the only thing I could afford, or I couldn't afford going to a gym at all. That's also an important conversation about access and breaking down barriers to access. So some gyms that have sliding scale options, I think that's a starting place. And knowing that they're out there, sometimes it takes a little work to find those spaces, but they're there. And sometimes they're online. There's also, I think the pandemic has given us a huge, big exponential growth in terms of online fitness offerings. So there are lots of people who have built fitness communities online and make it really connected and lovely. And some of those are specific to certain experiences or identities, people looking for a certain kind of environment. So there are options. There are a lot of people out there doing good work.
Cool. That's encouraging to hear. I was just, again, looking at the research that you've done, the 2 papers that you mentioned earlier, and some of the highlights that I saw. One of them jumped out at me, this idea of trauma experiences create this not only relational, but also bodily disconnection. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how you see the work that you're doing addressing that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up because that's a really important question. I mentioned earlier, as an example, people who lack interoceptive awareness, which we know is correlated with traumatic experience. And then we also know that some people with traumatic experiences have a heightened interoceptive awareness, that their alarm systems in terms of their sensory experience within their body are on alert all the time and kind of going off all the time, versus people who have a really hard time connecting with their body, noticing sensations, or who might feel really scared to do that because their body may have been the source of their trauma, right? And also for people who are more on the dissociative coping end of the spectrum, who are more disconnected as a result of their dissociation, it can feel really overwhelming to think about paying attention to your body, or it might just trigger something and people really struggle to do it. One of the things that I love so much about weightlifting is it involves an external stimulus, right? So I'm sure you've sat with clients before where you maybe invite them to kind of notice something in their body and maybe that's accessible to them. And maybe somebody else is like, I have no idea. I have no idea what I'm feeling.
Right.
Or they get overwhelmed even by sitting with a question. And with weightlifting, there is an external stimulus that you can orient towards, right? So if I have a barbell on my back, if I have a barbell in my hands, if I have a kettlebell in my hands or a dumbbell in my hands, or if it's even like how my feet feel different pressing into the floor when I have something that I'm holding onto that's weighing me down. There's this sensory stimuli that you can orient towards that I think can be an entry point to people connecting with their bodies differently and to becoming more embodied. And we hear that over and over again, too. I think about one of the clients I've worked with that I've done a lot of collaborative work between trauma-informed weightlifting, for them in the gym and then in therapy. There's collaboration between their coach and I.
Cool.
That this was someone who dissociated most of the day, most of the time, and barely dissociates now. And I really think that I know that they also know that weightlifting was a really important part of them being able to connect with their bodies because there were ways that they could pay attention to it that felt more accessible and was feeling the bench against their back, right, as they were bench pressing, or having to push into the ground with their feet when they were bench pressing, that there were suddenly these experiences that they had that were not as scary and overwhelming as them tuning into their internal sensory experience.
As you were talking, I had this memory of years ago, I read this interview with a gymnast. She had been, I think, world class. And she talked about how she was in this body that could do all these things. But she talked about how disconnected she actually felt from her body. And she didn't realize that. She always saw herself as, I'm an athlete. I'm very in my body. I'm very embodied. And she talked about how it was years later that she realized actually how disconnected she had been from her body. Partly she'd get an injury and she was told to push through or, these kinds of things. How would you say from your perspective, and maybe you have them sitting in the chair in front of you as a therapist, what are some ways that you can invite that connection with the body if you notice someone is seeming disconnected, or maybe they even say that they're disconnected if they have a history like this?
Oh, this is another really good question. Something that's coming to mind. There's a wonderful coach that has gone through our training programs and who continues to do some work with us. And she's in the UK and she is just a fantastic trauma-informed practitioner. And one of the things that she has shared in regards to her work with one of her clients in particular, who is highly dissociative and very disembodied for good reason, because of the trauma that had experienced them, and also because of things like gender dysphoria and harm they had experienced based on their identities and things like that. And so she started working with them to use experiences of soreness and muscle fatigue as a way to start to notice and connect. And that was the entry point. And it was such a fantastic and creative way to work with this person. I'm not saying that's the answer for everyone, but as an example, right, that the essentially lactic acid buildup and soreness in the body became an entry point to experiencing sensation. Because you could even get someone in the gym doing, let's say, a bicep curl, just as an example, and you might ask them what part of their bicep are they feeling the most, and they might say, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Right? And so it might be like, can you feel the difference between your hand when it's upright near your shoulder and the feeling of the weight in your hand when it's down next to your body? So one of the things that we offer in our trainings is a lot of thoughtfulness around distinguishing between external and internal cues. So for coaches and trainers or PTs or OTs or whoever to think about internal cues, or like inviting, tracking, essentially using interoceptive awareness within the body, versus external cues, things like noticing the barbell on your back. So essentially, we can use, even in this case, like the after effects of lifting as a way to start to sense into the body. So it's about finding an entry point. I know one client where the only thing she could really connect with was like nurdling is the texture on a barbell or on a dumbbell, feeling the nurdling in her hand. That was it. That's all she could do for quite a long time. But that was it. That was the orientation point. So we started there.
Wait, say more about that. So this person maybe had a hard time wanting to engage in like physical activity. And so that's what they could do is feel the nurdling on the barbell, or is that what you're saying?
No, not quite. More so that was kind of the only sensation that they could pay attention to.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. Yeah. And maybe that shows where my brain went. My brain also went to a place of like, okay, if someone has that history that I described as a gymnast, very, very active, and the pendulum kind of swung to, okay, I'm done with that. It's hard for me to be in my body. This is really painful. And now I don't want to move. Now I'm like in hypoarousal and I'm not wanting to move my body. Kind of a different situation, but maybe the root is similar.
Yeah. I mean, we certainly hear this from a lot of folks who were previously competitive athletes or elite athletes is, not only do you go through an identity crisis, but your relationship to your body changes so much. And, you mentioned earlier kind of like pushing through injury and things like that. That really to me is rooted in this cultural idea that no pain, no gain.
Right.
What? Like
What?
what? It turns out we can have all kinds of gain without pain. It's not a requirement, but what it does culturally, and I think it's important to pay attention to the systemic, what I would call like violations in these narratives that we're just indoctrinated into, which is your body is a machine and your body is here to produce, right? And so in terms of like when you think about capitalism and all of these intersecting oppressive forces, that's the point, is to be productive in our bodies. They are machines. And so when you are an athlete, you are expected to be a productive machine in your sport. And I find a lot of professional sports to be incredibly exploitative of people's bodies, right? I think the NFL is a great example of that. Like thinking about what we know now about concussions within the NFL, that person, that body is expected to perform, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity to support people in thinking about how do you develop a new relationship with your body, maybe if that's been a part of your world in your life.
Yeah. And I just think about the ways, in my own history of how I've maybe objectified myself in that way of like, oh, I got to do the thing. And I appreciate you highlighting that. Yeah.
Yeah. The trickle down is real. It shows up. It shows up everywhere and for all of us in lots of different ways.
Yeah. Gosh, this has been really fun. This is so needed. I'm really hoping to hear maybe if you have any specific experiences or maybe clients or anything that you would feel comfortable sharing to kind of illustrate some of the impactful work that you're doing.
Yeah, I can reference the clients I mentioned earlier, and she's told me she's comfortable with me sharing some about her story. How transformative. She is someone that was already lifting and then working with me in therapy, and then introduced the idea of like, what if we approach this in a trauma-informed way and your lifting became a part of your healing? Because there was also a lot of experiences of harm that she was having at the gym, and she was getting really dysregulated at the gym and having troubles with other people in the gym. And it just was like trigger central in a lot of ways. And so it was both exploring what that was about, what were those experiences representational of, how was it a symptom of some of the things that we've already talked about, how was some of it connected to her early life experiences. And so there was that as an exploration point within our work in therapy. But then it also became about collaborating with her coach to say, like, how can we specifically leverage or be intentional in some ways with her programming to think about how to increase her capacity to feel good in her body, right? So it was about both kind of like working around triggers or things that made her dysregulated. And this was someone who would get both hyperaroused and would dissociate a lot. Next time you're at the gym, maybe the homework is like noticing 3 sensations and movement that feel okay, like neutral, or maybe they feel good, but that like some things that don't feel bad. Let's make note of that and take that into consideration. Noticing collaboratively if there were movements in the gym that were triggering to her and would cause her to have a reaction, then we could bring that into therapy and explore that, right? Like we might be able to use some somatic work and sensory motor work or EMDR to process those experiences and to see what was being kind of showcased through her body in those movements. And then her goal then was like, then I want to go back to the gym and I want to reclaim these movements. I want to feel good doing them. So what's a journey from where I am now to where I would like to be? And then working with her coach to figure that out. And she's doing so well. And I think first and foremost to her credit, because she's amazing and she works so hard and she's so dedicated to her healing and growth. And weightlifting was a really big factor in that mix. Like, I don't think we would have just gotten there with psychotherapy. I really don't. And we were able to even do things like think about certain movements or positions in the gym that felt really empowering to her. And we would bring them into session and then we would resource them like we would through sensory motor or through EMDR, like using bilateral stimulation or other kind of visual resourcing where she could replicate and tap into that very visceral resource in her body because we were reinforcing experiences in the gym also in the context of our work together. So there was a lot of back and forth, lots of collaboration. It was like the trio of us worked together
That is so
very
cool.
closely. And I'm so grateful for that experience. And she's really been a teacher to me in that way too.
Very cool. Man, I got chills as you talked about that. Like she's reclaiming something so important to her and hearing about the collaboration. I mean, I don't know that I've heard too much about, psychotherapists collaborating with, you said it was like a strength coach or
Yeah.
Okay. That's so cool. Well, I just so appreciate your generosity of your time and sharing your wisdom with us in the things that you've discovered and the things that you're learning in your research. How can folks get a hold of you? How can they find your work? I know that we'll put some things in the show notes, but Can you share with us where people can access the things that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is traumainformedweightlifting.com. Plenty wordy for you. And then on Instagram, it's the same thing, same handle. Those are the two primary places. We do have an email newsletter. We don't send things out too often, but that way we keep people in the loop about research we're doing, different projects we're running. We have a directory for people who have gone through our certificate program on our website, and that will keep growing as more people go through that program. We send updates about our research projects. We also are always open to collaborating on research projects and things like that. We have a lot of wonderful research partners and community-based partners that we're doing several studies with right now, and we'll continue to focus on that. And then my website is Mariah Rooney, LCSW.com, because apparently I only associate with websites with really long URLs.
Sets you apart. Make sure there's no one else out there like you. I love it. I love it. Thank you again. This has been so enjoyable, and I'm looking forward to following your work. And you do have a lot of resources, not only on your website, but on your Instagram. I know that there's a lot of cool content on there that I was kind of binging. So thank you for all of that as well.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for being interested in us and this topic. And I feel so grateful for your openness and intrigue into just what some people is seemingly strange and to a lot of people is like kind of obvious, right? Like, how do we find ways to move our bodies and be in our bodies that feel better and support our healing?
What a perfect way to end. That's right. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We hope you're as excited as we are about the upcoming 2025 NARM Therapist trainings. Whether you choose the in-person training in Scottsdale, Arizona, or one of our live online cohorts, this advanced clinical training in the neuroaffective relational model will transform your practice. Through this advanced clinical training, you'll learn how to effectively address complex trauma and facilitate post-traumatic growth. You'll gain specialized training in a relationally focused, neurobiologically informed clinical approach that supports the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. You'll also be joining a dynamic community that offers multiple learning opportunities to deepen your professional and personal growth. Visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com to register for the 2025 NARM Therapist training that best fits your schedule. We hope you will join us in this special opportunity to advance your clinical practice and make a lasting impact on the lives of those you serve. The Complex Trauma Training Center emphasizes professional development in support of personal growth. We provide clinical trainings, online webinars, ongoing consult groups, mentorship programs, and community events. Our mission is to provide a relational, inclusive, and depth-oriented professional community for those seeking a supportive network of therapists working with complex trauma. To learn more about our trainings, programs, and events, please visit us on our website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.